about 5 months in office from that time. So I'm going to sort of give an overview of Ferguson in St. Louis and what happened on the ground. And then I'm going to ask questions of each one of these panelists who can sort of help us think through how this was possible, and then how we can hold prosecutors accountable. And then we're just going to open up and have a conversation about this phenomenon. So, there have been a wave of progressive prosecutor elections since around, really November 2016, sort of that label has sort of come up in the media. And Wesley Bell is one case. So on August 9th, 2014, Darryl Wilson, a white police officer, shot and killed a black teenager named Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which is a town northwest of St. Louis. Protests and demands for holding officers accountable and protecting black lives emerged. And the movement for Black Lives, which is really sort of started around the time of Trayvon Martin's killing by George Zimmerman and the acquittal of George Zimmerman, really took off also and was continued through Michael Brown's death. And on November 24th, 2014, Robert McCulloch, who was then the prosecuting attorney in St. Louis County, announced that the grand jury did not indict Darryl Wilson on any charges relating to the killing of Michael Brown. And so many observers at the time noted that McCulloch acted almost as a defense attorney in dealing with the grand jury. He failed to endorse any specific charges against the officer, and he presented so much evidence as to overwhelm many of the grand jurors in the room and to present doubt. And that's not really the classic way we think of prosecutors establishing probable cause, right? And actually, in his more than 2 decades as a prosecutor, Robert McCulloch, his office at least, had a history of failing to indict police officers using deadly force. In 2015, the Department of Justice published its scathing report of the city of Ferguson, its courts, and its police department detailing rampant abuse, economic exploitation, and racism targeted at its mostly black residents. Also in the same year, Wesley Bell, who was a former public defender, was then elected city councilman and took part in implementing the city's consent decree that they entered into with the Department of Justice. In August 2018, Bell won the Democratic primary for county prosecutor in St. Louis County by, I think, about 14 points, so a significant margin against the incumbent Robert McCulloch. And in November of last year, he won the general election as the Democrat. I think he was unopposed. And so in many ways, the story of Ferguson is probably very unique. At the same time, similar stories, at least outcomes, have been happening across the country. So we have Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore. We have Kim Foxx in Cook County. We have, of course, Larry Krasner here in Philadelphia. And so there are general themes that we could probably pull out from the specific case of Ferguson. And some of the things that we want to talk about today are, how did Wesley Bell specifically get elected? What was the role of journalists on the ground? What's the role of community activists, everyday citizens? How is he being held accountable now by the community or other people outside the community, such as the national sort of conversation or focus that's around the specific city? What problems do progressive prosecutors encounter in implementing reforms once they're elected? And what does it even mean to be a progressive prosecutor? What's this object that we keep talking about? What policies and practices should they pursue? So I'm going to go ahead now and introduce the panel. So all the way down here to my right and your all's left is Wesley Lowery, not to be confused with Wesley Bell.
Not the prosecutor.
He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning national correspondent covering law enforcement, race, and justice for the Washington Post, and an on-air contributor for CNN. He has been the paper's lead reporter covering police shootings and the movement for Black Lives. He was the lead reporter on the Fatal Force Project, which created a real-time database of police shootings and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2016, as well as the Murder with Impunity, an unprecedented analysis of neighborhoods in major American cities where police almost never solve homicides, which was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2019. To his left, we have Josi Nielsen. She's a communications strategist and former political consultant. And as communications director for the St. Louis County prosecuting attorney, Her current efforts focus on translating the intricacies of policy reform into messaging that engages and educates the public. In 2018, she successfully managed the primary election of Wesley Bell for St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney by rallying a diverse grassroots coalition and optimizing limited resources through data-driven marketing. She's also the former president and co-founder of Chat the Vote. Next to her is Reverend Darryl Gray. He's the president and CEO of Gray & Gray Associates and is the founder and senior pastor of the Imani Family and Full Gospel Baptist Church. And he's community and government liaison for the Ethical Society of Police Genesis. Reverend Gray has worked for decades promoting social justice and human dignity. He's worked tirelessly in Canada and also in the United States as an advocate for the reform of refugee and immigration policies, police community relations, minority business community youth development, and interfaith cooperation. Gray's comparison of St. Louis to the Old Selma and the Midwest to the Old South has resonated throughout the social justice community nationwide. In September 2017, he became one of the spokespersons for the St. Louis frontline protest and activist community following weeks of civil disobedience and disturbance resulting from the acquittal of former police officer Jason Stockley and the death of Anthony Lamar Smith, who was another unarmed black man. Reverend Gray has received numerous awards and honors in Canada and the United States. And then finally, to my right, my immediate right, is Bill Cobb. He's the founder of Cobblestone Solutions, a company that provides strategic solutions for government, for-profit, and nonprofit organizations. He's the former deputy director of the ACLU Campaign for Smart Justice. And at the ACLU, Bill co-led and designed the largest campaign in the organization's 98-year history. A historic effort aimed at reducing the US prison population by half while combating racial disparities at the same time. Bill and his team collaborated with ACLU affiliates, reform advocates, impacted communities, philanthropic leaders, and volunteers to craft and execute strategic campaigns in all 50 states to combat the primary drivers of mass incarceration. Bill resides in Philadelphia, where he serves on the boards of Community Legal Services, the Defender Association of Philadelphia, Philadelphia Legal Assistance, and he is a trusted advisor to many of the nation's leaders and influencers. So let's begin. So my first question is for Wesley. And so as a Washington Post journalist who was on the ground in the wake of the killing of Michael Brown and what arrived and emerged from the community after that grief, could you share your insights on the media's role in shaping and framing prosecutorial reform in St. Louis County?
Certainly. And thank you again for inviting me and for having me. It's great to be here, certainly alongside a panel talking about such an important issue in this moment. As was noted, we've had so many prosecutors across the country who have been elected under a progressive prosecutor mantle, or even those who aren't embracing that mantle, who are seeking to be smarter about the way the power of a prosecutor's office is wielded. I think that what we know, and I think one of the reasons we've ended up with so many of these prosecutors doing the work they're doing, is because we know that inside the criminal justice system, the prosecutor holds the most and some of the most crucial power. But that is the result, that's the conclusion. And so in some ways we have to look back and think about how we got to that conclusion. What I think is interesting about the media is the media in many ways is an extension of the public. And so when you look at an issue like criminal justice, much less criminal justice reform or policing reform, the media itself very often comes along the learning process the same way that the public does. And so I think back to August 9, 2014, when Michael Brown was killed, and we had a media both nationally and locally in many places that itself was remarkably naive about these processes and how they worked and what they looked like. There was an abiding sense, certainly from some of the national media, but it came out through a lot of the analysis and commentary as well, that, well, if Officer Darryl Wilson has done anything wrong, they'll punish him. Why are all these people in the streets? Why are they upset? Aren't there processes for this to figure out if this is justified or unjustified or not? We hadn't done at the time because there was so little available, certainly national data, but in many places even local data. There wasn't much actual factual underpinning or understanding among the public, and again, the media is an extension of the public, about how often police officers are charged in these cases, about whether or not a charging decision can be something that serves as proxy for whether or not a shooting should have happened or should not have happened, because that's a very different question. Much less the broader role of prosecutors in our kind of era of mass incarceration, which by 2014 was a decade into our nomenclature. And so we started to see the media beginning to ask these questions and learn these answers the same way the public did. I remember among the first pieces we did, so you get to a place like Ferguson, you begin asking questions. What people are saying is they're saying, you're asking them, why are you in the street? Why are you here? What are you upset about? And people are saying, well, we want justice. These cops always get off when they kill us. There's no accountability, and these prosecutors are too close to these police departments. And what we begin seeing as you apply pressure to that, and as you research and report out these stories in broader ways, the underpinnings, no matter how articulately or not the statements of a demonstrator or a protester are expressed, have a factual basis. The communities are speaking to a truth that is objectively a truth. We know at the time in St. Louis, St. Louis County, Bob McCullough was a prosecutor. He'd been a prosecutor for decades, a prominent Democrat, dear friends of the senator and the mayor at the time, and someone from a law enforcement family himself, frequently honored by police and buddies with the police, and someone who had been one of the leading megaphones certainly through the 90s and early 2000s, speaking about the need to get the thugs and criminals out of the street and to prosecute in hard ways, and someone who, in some other cases, the thing about communities is they don't forget what happens to their communities, who had been a spokesperson at times attacking or besmirching people who ended up being relatively innocent victims of police violence. There was a lot of anger. We forget it. It gets written out of the narrative sometimes, but there was a lot of anger around a 2001 shooting in St. Louis. It's called the Jack in the Box shooting, in which two black men had been shot and killed as part of a failed drug sting, including an innocent man sitting in the passenger seat, and the officers asserted the car had been thrown in reverse and was driving at them, and then a video that had been suppressed for a significant amount of time proved that was not the case. And the prosecutor at the time, Bob McCullough, was in the media talking about how both of these guys had it coming and they were cancers to their community, and the one guy was just a barber who happened to be sitting in the wrong car at the wrong time. I remember those early days in Ferguson, people invoking that shooting time and time and time and time again. Very often the incident in the news today is not about the incident in the news today. It's about the thing we remember and what it makes us remember from a year ago, from 2 years ago, from 20 years ago. As we begin looking at Bob McCullough and his record, it's not just about his rhetoric, but it's also about, what is his relationship with, what are his political relationships like, but also what is his record as a prosecutor, or get specifically on issues of policing. Bob McCullough was a prosecutor who had almost never in 20 or 30 years as the county prosecutor prosecuted a police officer in a use of force incident, even though St. Louis and St. Louis County at the time and to date still has some of the highest rates of police use of force in any of the departments in the nation. Now, again, no prosecutor is going to have a very high prosecution record for police use of force, because what we know is that the vast majority of police use of force, whether it should have happened or not, is legal and not prosecutable. But Bob McCullough had it. But again, it speaks to the frustration in these spaces. I think that the media very often drives the conversation. I think that by the time we get to, I think the frustration that builds around issues of use of force, of officers not being prosecuted and the rarity with which they are, not only in a place like St. Louis, but then the reporting we do nationally to find that over the course of a decade nationally, there had only been 60 police officers prosecuted for a fatal police shooting, less than 0.5% of fatal police shootings. That frustration, the extent to which both the law and the prosecution's decisions felt out of step with the public's desire for accountability, then combined with the now gained knowledge a decade after Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and conversations around issues of mass incarceration and the power that a prosecutor has in so many cases in terms of the strategy and the subjective decisions they're making, combine to create a reality and an environment in which people, voters, decided they wanted something different. After decades of rewarding the person who can convince the electorate that they are going to be the meanest to bad people, many voters were now very interested in someone who was going to be smarter about what happened. And I think that set a lot of the table for many of these elections across the country. And the media has certainly played a role in reframing some of the conversation that we're having around these issues.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I really appreciated your sort of statement of it's important to actually speak to the community members who have a history of dealing with this themselves, right? And they sort of bringing that up to you as a reporter, right? And able to share not only the stories that you're seeing on the ground with your own eyes, but also their stories and what they've experienced.
Certainly.
And Josi, I wonder sort of in thinking about the actual election moment for Wesley Bell, right? So moving from this moment of protest and this moment of people sort of sharing their voices in the streets and through journalists, could you sort of talk about, one, what are the reasons that PA Wesley Bell himself ran for election, right? And then also, could you, as his former campaign manager and his current communications director, also share with us sort of how you think about the office and engagement with the community in sort of crafting your reform ideas?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is a really huge honor to be sitting here and having these conversations. Wesley was probably 5 years old when he decided he wanted to be an attorney. And his father, who was a police officer, was the primary influence that pushed him to open his eyes and see that was a path available to him. And from that age on, he saw the final peak of that career being a judge. And it wasn't until probably midway through law school that he began to realize more and more that prosecutors actually are the ones who have the power to make the changes that his life presented to him as things that needed to change. He ran for office for this position as prosecutor, I believe, because his entire life led up to that being the only choice that he had. He had come from North County in St. Louis. As a kid, he didn't get into trouble, but he got stopped frequently driving around North County. Didn't know there was anything wrong with the fact that he was stopped for nothing, forced to get out of the car. And again, in law school, realizes, oh, there was something wrong about this. Comes back to St. Louis, first career in the public defender's office, working with juveniles, working with people who have stories that have stuck with him for the last 2 decades to be things that he is now in a position to shift. And after a public defender, he went into private defense practice, again, having a very large pro bono caseload and continuing to work on the issues that were there all over St. Louis County and the city as well. He spent time as a municipal judge and a municipal prosecutor in several of our municipalities in North County. I don't know how much you all know about the way our county is broken down, but we have somewhere around 88 municipalities contained within St. Louis County, which is separate from St. Louis City, that has a population 1/3 the size of the county. The city is a home rule city, and the county encircles it. Ferguson is right there to the north, 15 minutes north of where I live, 10 minutes north of where Rev lives, and it's all really one big community, even though we are so broken down into our tiny little governments. And of those 88 municipalities, there's probably 54 police departments in addition to the St. Louis County Police Department. So Wesley's probably seen quite a lot of the results from this fractured geography that we have and fractured policing. So when Wesley Bell is, coming out of his time as a private defense attorney, he has the opportunity to go and be the head of the criminal justice department at St. Louis Community College in Florissant Valley, and spent 7 years there finding an avenue for the work that he was doing as a public defender to begin to have relationships with young people coming out of North County who may be the first generation in their family to be going through college, and to be able to direct them to the same thing that his father gave him, which is, you have the ability to pursue this career and you have the ability to make these changes. And he did that. We know then in March of 2015, he was elected as the Ferguson City Councilman for Ward 3. He lived on West Florissant Avenue, and he witnessed everything that happened after Michael Brown was killed. He witnessed that from his front door. There was no other option for him but to come out and serve the community in the way that he was most suited for. During that period as councilman, he was involved in negotiating the Ferguson consent decree and drawing then from so much of what he had learned in the preceding years serving on municipal benches in North County. I think it was 2015 or 16, he recalled somewhere around 4,000 old warrants that were just hanging out there and not furthering justice. He was one of the first prosecutors to take that large action then. So fast forwarding to his second term as councilman and the realization that this seat, this prosecutor, was now up for contention. The primary in 2014 was 3 or 4 days before Michael Brown was killed. And a woman named Leslie Broadnax ran in that race. She did not do very well against Bob McCullough. And there were signs that I remember seeing back during the general election of 14 that even though, well, they were a vote for Stanger is a vote for Bob McCullough. Steve Stanger is not our county prosecutor, I'm sorry, county executive anymore. He was until about 2 weeks ago when he was indicted by the feds, pled guilty and resigned. So everything that Wesley brings to the table from what I've seen in the last 15 months of working with him is a perspective of going through every element of the legal system, working on behalf of people that do not have the ability to take care of themselves, and bringing that justice to the forefront of everything he does. So he ran because there was no other option, and he won because there was no other option. And with the community engagement shaping his platform, I think it's the exact same answer, really, is he'd spent so much time seeing where the breaks were and seeing what things could be fixed that may not be apparent to somebody looking in from the outside, that this legal mechanism exists and we are abusing it drastically here. He then, as the power of a municipal prosecutor, was able to do a lot of small level things that began to push that ball forward. And realizing how much we needed to begin to have that on a broader scale in St. Louis County and lead the region in reforms, he took the opportunity to consolidate all that knowledge, put together a platform that is designed to end mass incarceration through the ways that we have that ability in St. Louis County. And then we went and did it. There's a conversation I had a few months ago with Ray Hartman, who's the founder of the Riverfront Times and a frequent Donnybrook guest. And it was the first time we actually met, and he came up and said, "So I don't understand, and I've never seen this before. Explain it to me. You guys put a platform together, and then you ran on it, and then you got elected, and now you're doing it." Yeah. And I had to pause and appreciate the gravity of that. We get to do what we said we were going to do because there is no other option. And despite the opposition we have seen from some elements in St. Louis County and probably some national as well, there's nothing that's slowing us down in this, and we've made amazing progress. On the 100th day of his administration, which was April 11th, we calculated what the reduction of the jail population was, and the total population had dropped by 12%. Of that, 68% was from C, D, and E felonies being reduced. And that is, we were all a little bit stunned. I mean, we knew it had gone down, but to actually see that number was a very powerful moment that with almost no resources other than the people in the office, specifically our Director of Diversion, Julia Fogelberg, and Josh Canavan, who have personally been the ones looking at everybody who is in the jail and seeing who is there, who is not a danger to our community, who's sitting there simply because they are too poor to be able to buy their way out, and to remove the barriers for them that allow them to be back out in society with their families, in employment, in education, and contributing to our increased public safety, and to prevent for people who are, a year ago, would have been held on a $500 cash bond that they couldn't pay for a low-level larceny charge. They don't spend the night in jail anymore. And when you start to look at the data that shows how just a single night in jail or 3 nights behind bars increases your rate of recidivism by 40%. You take that to 5 nights behind bars, your rate of recidivism hits 50%, and it keeps going up from there. So if we can intervene at that critical moment, and if we can take the people who are committing crimes that are, the root causes can be traced directly back to poverty and to addiction. 40% of the crimes charged in St. Louis County are possession, burglary second, robbery second, and stealing. These are not crimes of violence against people. These are not reasons why we need to be putting them behind bars and away from society. These are reasons why we need to be connecting them with resources to put them in positions where they can make better choices in the future. And that is one of the primary things that this office is embarking on now. So, yeah, I could go on for a while, but
Yeah,
that's
I'm sure
about it.
there will be many questions insisting that you go on to hear more. I really appreciated the community sort of seeing and understanding how Wesley Bell is the community in many ways. He is part of these mostly impacted communities, these heavily and disproportionately impacted communities, and thinking of, it's not like there's this clear dichotomy right now between the prosecutor's office necessarily, or at least him necessarily. There's also, he is part of the community. And Reverend Gray, I wonder if you could sort of give us a little bit more insight into the community or communities that are impacted within St. Louis County, and sort of your work with these communities, and how over several decades you've helped to keep and think about keeping criminal justice officials accountable to the community. And I love your analogy to the old Selma and saying St. Louis. It's really provocative and profound, and really thoughtful to think about, this new civil rights movement. And I wonder if you could sort of give us that historical lens of the community.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm in awe. My role today was simply to sit here and say ditto to everything that everybody else said, but I guess I won't be able to do that. I think all of us have witnessed this growing awareness that Michael Brown's murder, people call it his death and a lot of things, but Ferguson activists, most folk in St. Louis call it a murder. And we're very clear about the language that we use, and we understand the impact of it. And Michael Brown's murder was simply not some aberration. It was a symptom of the criminal justice system that promoted mass incarceration and promoted or encouraged violence against people of color, too often by police officers. If we talk about statistics, St. Louis, the region has more police officers in that region than any other municipality in the country per capita. But our murder rate is still number 1. Our crime rate is still number 1 or 2 in the country. And so more police have not solved that problem. As an activist, when we think about Ferguson, and now we think about activists who understood that they had to move from protests to politics to policy, and had to make a determination of priority. And as you said, from Trayvon Martin to Mike Brown was definitely different. It was different than Sandra Bland. It was different than Eric Gardner. It was different from Freddie Gray, not just because of the murder, but because of the way that Mike Brown as a human being, although lying dead, was left dead for 6 hours uncovered. And so it just, because the police didn't cover him up, it uncovered what was taking place in St. Louis County and in the Midwest. Activists decided that Ferguson was going to become our rallying cry throughout the nation. We decided that Ferguson and the death of Mike Brown was going to be what galvanized activists and created this new civil rights movement. As Black Lives Matters folk would say, a movement that is not my grandmother's movement. Although we found out in a lot of our tactics that we've been using since Mike Brown, it's all our grandmother's movement. We realized that this race would be our mark. It would be the civil rights watershed moment. If any progress was going to happen, it would have to be done in this election. And most activists out of Ferguson would say, from Mike Brown's murder to now, to Wesley Bell's election, not much had happened in the region. Not much had happened. National figures came and went. Jesse, Al, NAACP, SCLC, everybody came and went. No infrastructure was created at all. Nothing. Some civil rights, some Ferguson folk, as the young folks say, blew up and left St. Louis. Many never to return. That became the reality. So you have to picture now Wesley coming, criminal justice reform being the #1 issue, focused around mass incarceration, focused around police shootings, focused around cash bail, focused around mandatory minimums, all of these things. And they said, this is our moment. Wesley Bell is our moment. Why was Wesley Bell so appealing to an activist community? Because he was homegrown. They knew Wesley. He wasn't parachuted in. Born there, raised there. Activists saw him in Ferguson. Activists heard his response to Michael's death. They watched him. He filled everything. A good-looking young man. Well, what can I say? Intelligent, educated. His integrity was above reproach. And as Josi said, it was interesting. To be honest, no one else could have done it.
Right.
Throughout the region, no one else could have pulled this off. No one else. Wesley was the only one that could have pulled this off because of all those things. He was the excellent product, but then as Josi said, I think that the campaign and others understood that in order for it to become a reality, that a coalition had to be formed, as Dr. King would say, a coalition formed out of need and not desire. A bunch of unusual suspects. Protesters, activists, progressives, church folk, everybody. The reality was it was an Obama-like movement. It was young millennials who understood the techno language and what it meant to text and to tweet, and church folk who understood that 90% of our members are registered, but only 30% of them vote. It was Color of Change who came in and did a Saturday afternoon texathon, where you bring in 300 people, you feed them at the Marriott, and you say, this is your text list, and you reach out to 25,000 people in an afternoon. It was ACLU who could not endorse, but educated. And so all of this came to all of this, we talked about it last night, the stars aligned. They did. You have the perfect candidate at a critical time. and a campaign that was able to motivate and mobilize. You had parallel campaigns running for Wesley. I mean, you had national campaigns running for Wesley. You had Black Church doing the Wesley thing, Progressive doing the Wesley thing, Color Change doing the Wesley thing, ACLU doing the Wesley thing, and Wesley's campaign doing the Wesley thing. All of that happening at the same time. It was phenomenal. And no one thought that he couldn't win, and it never came up in discussion. We understood those of us who have been in politics, and when you said I've been doing this for years, I'm the oldest, I'm just decades. You mentioned decades, it's been decades.
Apologies.
We understood that nationally, 80% of races to elect prosecuting attorneys go unchallenged.
Nobody runs.
Nobody runs. And against Bob McCullen of 27 years in St. Louis County, which doing nothing has become normal, or had become normal. Doing nothing was normal. And so this broke the normal. Mike Brown broke the normal. You had the Stockley verdict and that 90 days of protest. And so everybody was geared up to actually make something happen. And folk decided to go from protest to politics to policy, recognizing the prosecutor as the middleman. If you're talking about the criminal justice system, the prosecutor is the middleman or the middlewoman. I mean, we got it. We understood what our target had to be. And then finally, how do you bring this together? We realized that particularly in Missouri, number one in murder, number 1 or 2 in violent crime, number 1, 2, or 3, poverty, unemployment, preschool, I'm talking about kindergarten suspension. I'm talking about black kids getting kicked out of kindergarten at disproportionate numbers. We understood that if we didn't make a move now with Wesley, it would be years before we would be in a situation to change anything. And then finally, when we talk about accountability, we trust Wesley. You know, activists are cynical by nature, I think. We want to be optimistic, but we're not too optimistic. We're really not. But we trust Wesley. We believe in his integrity. And it bared itself out a couple of weeks ago. You've got McCullen in 27 years, never charged a police officer. You had Wesley Bell right after his first 100 days, local municipality police officer, gets a call, local supermarket, lady, black woman accused of shoplifting. She's running away from the police officer, accused of shoplifting. Officer shoots her in the back. Officer says, I was reaching for my taser, but I got my gun. But I shot more than once. But I was reaching for my taser. But I shot more than once.
Multiple
With,
first taser.
which what wasn't a taser, right? Wesley charged. Within his first, right after his first 100 days, Wesley charges a police officer. 27 years. And we can talk about some other things, I mean, we've made it clear as activists that it doesn't matter if you're black, white, brown, male, female, it doesn't matter. We're going to hold you accountable. Period. And I think through what we're seeing across the country, I think that prosecuting attorneys understand now that we understand how to influence them, and it is by way of the vote. With Wesley Bell and others across the country, moderate to conservative prosecutors, I think, have received a wake-up call from this election, that activists understand how to mobilize, how to build coalitions, and are ready and willing to engage in the political process. That's how we hold anybody elected, but particularly prosecutors, accountable. And that's how we will.
Thanks so much for that. I really appreciated also sort of your statement of the stars aligned, right? And sort of the analogy to Obama, right, is this almost like singular election that only could have happened with this person. But that also brings up sort of the idea that maybe, you know, is this replicable, right? Like, how unique is this, and could we make sure that, you know, whenever Wesley Bell no longer is the PA, that we're able to replicate this again? Are the stars going to have to align, right? Or is it if we just invest in the community and take time, and church leaders take time, and people make sure people are voting, it will happen again? And so I wonder, Bill, if you could sort of help us think about, you know, you've sort of been on the national vanguard, really, and I wonder if you could help us think about what lessons we can take from this case of Wesley Bell and Ferguson to inform other DA elections. You know, the 80% number that Reverend Gray mentioned, you know, even places where they're not even beginning to contest elections, but where they are contesting elections, what lessons can we take? But then also, what sort of have you seen have been sort of the common factors that account for successful reform or progressive prosecutors being elected?
Thank you. So the things that are common, I look at the election of Wesley not singularly, because I've been driving the work across the country, so I'm looking at the totality of all the races. They have to have a variety of factors in order for a candidate to be electable, in particular to this movement, to intentionally identify people who are prosecutors or will serve as prosecutors, and then have them choose to be restorative rather than punitive. And I think that's what the real definition, like the term progressive prosecutor, I'm not in love with it. Many of the prosecutors are not, because it comes with the label is unidentified in terms of the expectations that people have when they give you that. But what we want are prosecutors who believe that people are redeemable, and that you don't have to throw away people forever in order to increase public safety, as their job is to do. And people who will abandon the practice of believing that their success as a prosecutor is the number of convictions or the amount of years in which their office has actually put people in cages, which is destroying lives across the country. So you have to have a candidate. And one of the things that I notice in where we are successful in winning the elections or persuading, I'll say that we are successful in winning the elections. I won't pull any punches because I'm no longer with the ACLU. So what you want to do is a candidate who's a part of the community, who is trusted, who has already served the community, in opposition to the punitive practices of the offices or of law enforcement. So in Wesley's case and Larry's case, and in the case of others, they were always already defending people who were accused or marginalized communities or black and brown communities. And as he indicated, Wesley is a part of the community. He is not separate. So that person has to be a trusted community member. Here in the city of Philadelphia, Larry was elected because he had been defending people for 30 years. Those are the individuals who were the activists. So as a result of that, there's a viable candidate. Then because of media, we have expertly been able now to leverage media and continue to drive the narratives by pushing out stories, by highlighting incidents of brutality. And unfortunately, just as he indicated, like King said, it literally sometimes takes a tragedy for you to get seismic outcomes, or people to actually decide to do something that they've abandoned, or something that their previous people before did for success. But we tend to put those things down until we need them again, and something horrific happens, and then we remember that we have the ability to connect with one another, hold power accountable, and then to wield it. We don't actually have to just hold power accountable. A part of directly impacted people, meaning the people who have served times in jails and prisons, who have been invested in political outcomes throughout the country for as long as I've been involved with the criminal justice system, which is going on nearly 30 years. They've always participated in local politics. They've always been the individuals who have knocked on the doors during campaigns. This is one of the populations where lots of people are never working. And so when you're a political operative, you know to go to halfway houses and reentry centers and community-based organizations that service that population to go ahead and offer people a stipend for working those particular days. And so people who are impacted by the problems have been participating in politics, but never around identifying a particular office for a very thing that's so close to them. And so it needed to have community. Everywhere there's been a win, there's been a robust community of activists who are already very seasoned, who know the landscapes, who have significant audiences, who are trusted messengers. And so you also have to have the larger institutions and the big box establishments have to come in and kind of sort of just hold the space so that those communities can lead those efforts. It's not for the SPLCs and the ACLUs and the NAACPs to come in and drive the local things or to even determine what the North Star would be. We're just there to kind of sort of leverage whatever things we have, the resources that we have, and then hold the space so that players who don't traditionally come together, they will come together when it's an outside entity or when there's an amount of resources. In most of these cases, these elected officials or these people who are running for prosecutor to run and win this office, they don't have the resources. They don't have the financial resources. And so organizations and institutions can spend money on GOTV, they can spend money on voter education, the ACLU and the SPLCs and NAACPs, they already have a big base of voters. They already do scorecards. And so it was just combining what the Ivy Tower was doing and then allowing for communities to actually determine what to do with the limited resources that anybody could contribute in time and energy. And so it always has to be deeply rooted in community in order for you to get the change. And the places where we made investments to produce the same outcome and it hadn't been rooted in community or the community isn't driving it, you're not necessarily getting the outcome of getting the election won. So to be very honest with you, I would think collectively the movement has lost more elections than it's actually won.
Interesting. That's very fascinating. So yeah, the local community element is something that I think is a thread that runs through all of your comments. And I'm wondering, before I get to the questions from the audience, which there are a lot, so I'm just gonna ask one quick question. I'm wondering if you can tell me, so after we do this, after we elect a restorative or progressive prosecutor, so how do we nationally and locally, local communities, keep them accountable? And I think this question is actually more specific. I have a question. If now in St. Louis County, people really do feel that Wesley Bell is being held accountable, that he's doing what the community has asked. And part of that question, I mean, I know specifically the indicting that police officer. I mean, that is right. That is what, police abuse is what the community started thinking about with the death of and killing and murder of Mike Brown, right? But there are other things that the community is interested in with respect to progressive prosecutors doing. And, it sounds like the jail population is going down, and that's amazing. But are there other things that the community still wants that they're not getting? And how is the community reacting and pushing back and making sure that he pushes in the direction they want?
Well, I mean, he's already beginning to talk about a diversion program. He's already moving cases that were, I guess, traditionally, historically, criminal cases to civil cases. Our litmus test is this. When the Police Officers Association and the Fraternal Order of Police come at you, you must be doing a good job. And in Wesley's case, you had prosecutors who had been working for McCullen for years, who decided that they were going to join the Police Officers Association and start a union. You didn't do it under McCullen, but you're going to do it under Wesley. And the bulk of them were white prosecutors. Wesley has already begun, I think anyway, to put some of his harder initiatives in place. And once again, it is similar to the whole Obama thing, the healthcare thing. Let me go ahead and put this hard stuff out here first because they may not allow me to be prosecutor much longer. And that's what we've seen Wesley do. He's already saying, these were the things I promised. And he's already begun to deliver and has already getting not only the pushback from police unions, but he's got legislators who are now trying to write legislation to curtail his activity. And activists are monitoring now everything that is said about it, be it good or bad. And when we hear about the diversion programs, when we hear about the work that he is doing through our own networks, our own media networks, we're putting that information out. And we know that that information is getting back to Wesley because many of Wesley's inner circle are the same people who have marched with us. They've advocated with us, Josi being one of them. And so, you know, we're not giving him any leeway at all. You know, we're showing up at county council meetings. I think that, real quick, remember I'm a preacher. Real quick, my grandmother would say, to make a long story short, after she's talked about it for 3 hours, we are monitoring. Activists today are not just, remember when I mentioned protests to politics to policy, we're now monitoring the politics. We're FaceTiming, we're live streaming, where everything that is done politically now, we're putting it out there. And so I think that that's what we have decided would be our method of accountability. And
I want to, to piggyback on that. I don't like the language of accountability and relationships to these people that we are getting elected. I like thinking about it as if I was wealthy and I could contribute $100,000 to somebody's campaign. It would give me access to have conversations with them about any policy, litigation, legislation, or anything in their influence. It's the same way with people who are activists or from community who are now working to get these individuals elected. They become a part of the organization. So now activists are working inside of the district attorney's offices, as he indicated in Wesley, and across the country. And so the goal and objective was never to elect a progressive prosecutor, or never to elect a mayor, or never to elect a city council person. The goal and objective is to acquire political capital and to leverage that to continue to advance the fight, because systems of oppression are resilient, are hyper resilient. And so the election, the successful execution of any tactic, or the great progress towards any strategy for us is never going to actually just have us put down our weapons and shields and go home. We're always going to be under attack, and we're always going to have to leverage the fight. And so now being engaged in political or electoral politics, it's not something temporary, it's something that's permanent and something that is going to, I think, forever influence not only how we respond to crime in America, but I think every aspect of our lives here in this country, as people are now far more interested in being engaged in the democratic process. I know we're looking at it through the lens of a progressive prosecutor, but the truth of the matter is that marginalized people, because of technology and because of other advances, now have a better sense of what it means to be represented by government, what your opportunities to participate in government are, and how you can leverage that power to effectuate change in your life and the lives of the people near you.
I don't know if
Just as far as the accountability that I think from inside the office now we do feel is something that we pay attention to. We have had a relationship with the Reform Coalition in St. Louis, which represents many groups who were involved in activism going back 2014 and before. The ACLU and Color of Change are two of the larger national organizations whose local presence is part of the Reform Coalition, and they've been involved with us in policy dialogue since August 8th of 2018. We've started having these conversations immediately after the primary victory, and we have continued to have those. And since being in office, it's changed a little bit from my perspective, because suddenly now I am a civil servant. I can't talk about campaigns directly, and the duty of what can and cannot flow through the mouthpiece that I now sit to be is slightly different. So I have great appreciation for the people from Reform Coalition who I've known for years, who now have the patience with me and with Wesley when sometimes the things that we are able to say publicly may not be as emphatically in line with what they are asking for. But like Darryl said, the trust that exists between the community and him has been fostered through this entire process, and I think is one of the most important pieces that we have, because there will continue to be things that come up where there is disagreement from the community and how it was handled, whether from the police or from the activist world. And I have known a few politicians in my life, and I have probably never encountered someone who I know as closely as I do Wesley, who is as authentic and genuine. And the fact that he is the force that is leading this charge, that's why I'm sitting here and ready to put everything I have. That's why every other person who came through the campaign with him came on board during the transition to help with policy, and is now coming in the office as we are able to hire more folks. This is something unlike any other professional endeavor I've seen happen, and it's an amazing thing to witness. So, yeah.
So the next, there are several questions that are sort of related, so I'll kind of ask them together. But they're all sort of related to specifics about getting elected. So one is asking about financial support. So specifically, how do we, and did we in this case, get financial support on the ground? And what financial support is needed for these elections? Also, several questions, or 2 or 3, asked sort of about the tension between, so for example, in St. Louis County, it's what, 2/3 is white and 1/3 is black, right? In the whole county. We got 54 police departments. We have a very big county, and we have people with diverse interests and people who think differently about what the problems in communities are, and how to solve them. And so how does an election hold those coalitions together to get elected, and then also remain accountable to those disparate interests?
And quickly, in Wesley's case, and we were there with, through the whole campaign. I can talk about some of the grassroots, ground game stuff that we did. I don't know, as Josi said, I don't know how much he can talk about campaigns and money. We understood going in to this campaign that Bob McCullough would have more money. I mean, 27 years connected with the party, knows where all the bodies are buried, probably put a couple of them there himself. So we understood that. As far as what I think Wesley's strength was, knowing that he was not going to out fundraise Bob McCullough, is to make sure that there was an authentic ground game. I think that when Color of Change came in, Color of Change set up an office in Ferguson, which I thought was masterful. They set up an office in Ferguson in a business that had been destroyed as a result of the Ferguson uprising. And so you're already going in and you're making it personal. Color Change made it personal. They came in and they taught a lot of us organizers how to organize political campaigns. They taught us, as I said, the Twitter strategy. They provided the money, but they also provided the training. So they came in to train organizers, and I thought that to me was one of the key points. But we didn't get away from the block parties. We didn't get away from all of the things that we did in the church. So I think that we contacted the churches. We identified people within the churches who had the church membership list, which also is the church voter registration list. We made sure that we had church vans and buses available for that day. So, I mean, for us as organizers, it was less the money part and more the organizing the body part.
The investment comes through C3 and C4, of course. And so one of the ways is like when the ACLU can't make a contribution to a campaign and can't, what you can do is spend money for a GOTV operation. You can spend money for, we spent money just to get formerly incarcerated people to be a part of the people on the ground who actually knock the doors of voters in those neighborhoods. And so you need investments, but I think lots of us know that all the money in the world and a very bad investment is not going to produce the outcome, and that's what we've been able to do. Typically, political consultants hire people who are going to get armies of people to just behave in a certain way. I need you to call. I need you to text. I need you to knock doors. Well, when you have a grassroots campaign, you just need to spend the money on having the infrastructure for the organization. You want to compensate people who work on the campaign. And so we operate campaigns significantly more efficiently and effectively financially than traditional campaigns. But doing traditional things and by squeaking out a new efficiency and effectiveness and having people who are directly impacted actually be the people who are championing the cause, because it's not so much about Wesley. He was just another part of the puzzle with all the stars aligning and then direct resources, and then having the sophistication that organizations like Color of Change and others have developed in how to leverage grassroots activity and turn it into political outcomes is something that, you know, there needs to be more money going into. But the traditional campaign investments where you're merely sending flyers or you're doing those things, you know, buttons and mailers, those things aren't effective in changing these sorts of outcomes. You really do have to be rooted in community. You have to make your dollar investment there in order to get these sorts of outcomes to happen.
We were outspent 12 to 1. A lot of us didn't take paychecks during the majority of the campaign. We had an amazing group of volunteers that were working directly with the campaign. The independent expenditures that Color of Change and the ACLU were able to make, I think those get somewhere around $300,000, right, which is 3 times more than we ever touched. And they were running radio spots when we were never going to be able to afford to run a radio spot. We did scrape enough together to spend $6,000 on billboards. That was amazing. And I remember seeing a billboard that Color of Change had put up, and I knew nothing about that it was going to be there. All of a sudden, we see the physical manifestation of people out there campaigning for him that we can't, because of the campaign laws, have any association with. And yet, out there, all across the highways of North County and St. Louis, those messages are being put forth. So one of the ways that we got funding and national attention was through endorsements. Democracy for America, Color of Change, their PAC, Real Justice PAC as well, were all able to give us national level attention. They did some fundraising emails on our behalf, and the only one that was able to actually stand up and commit any campaign contributions to us was Real Justice PAC, which is Sean King's organization. And I remember when that $5,000 check hit our bank, it was within 3 weeks of the primary, and that was a critical amount. Like, the bank account was around $1,000 most days when I was looking at it. We did not have much to work with, and yet we worked with what we had. So getting the national attention from the funders who can direct national dollars to local races like this, I think needs to be expanded significantly. And I hope that our election shows that even when things look impossible from the outside, those are conversations I had with some of the people from the national orgs who didn't support us financially prior, we looked like a bad investment. We weren't. We internally knew that we were going to win. Nobody believed us, and I hope next time somebody looks like a Wesley Bell, they are able to get some more dollars in their bank accounts from the organizations that are pushing this nationally, because the change has to be at that local level. And we can talk about it all day long on the front page of New York Times, but if it's not on the front page of the St. Louis American, the oldest and best black newspaper in the country, then we're not actually having the conversation we need to be having.
It was interesting, you know, that when I asked people, because one of my responsibilities was to help get volunteers, it was easy. One out of five black men in St. Louis region are somehow involved in the criminal justice system. 1 out of 5 are involved in some way. So you can. There's not many families who are not taking this personal.
Correct.
So if you're talking about a candidate, if you're talking about criminal justice reform, particularly to African American people, we do take it personal. And so any candidate is going to have to tailor their remarks, their statement around that, and really be able to speak directly to individuals. That's how we were able to get those 90% voter lists to cause them to vote up to 60, 70%. Because it was personal. Missouri is number 1 in mass incarceration in the state, in the country. Missouri's number 1, top 10. Missouri's number 1. And so, once again, when we talk about the stars aligning, when Wesley talked about mass incarceration and mandatory minimums and all of these things, he was talking to people who have relatives that will benefit from a Wesley Bell. And we're not talking about eliminating public safety, because Wesley was very clear about that.
It increases.
Exactly.
So another question sort of moves away from prosecutors who are elected to federal prosecutors who are appointed, right? So I'm wondering what you all sort of think about the role of the community, engagement, and sort of democratic appeals in relation to an appointed sort of office, or the role of the media in relation to an appointed office.
In terms of the role of the media, I think that, again, I think we have to talk about, I think anytime we're in insider spaces, we have to grapple with what the rest of the world, being people who aren't dorks about prosecution, know about prosecution. That most polling shows that most Americans don't even know that their prosecutors are elected, right?
Exactly.
Right, and the media plays, excuse me, and the media plays a role in that, not only in terms of clarifying and reinforcing our public knowledge of who our elected officials are, but most prosecutors' races don't even receive media coverage, or if they do, it's one story or a one-off. Beyond that, and this is a conversation happening in media spaces, but maybe not enough, is how do the conventions of how we cover these stories serve or provide disservice to our voters. One pet peeve of mine is, I don't think you should ever read an article about an election that doesn't have the date of the election in it. Yet I bet if you went to, I'll criticize my own publication, I bet if you went to the WashingtonPost.com right now, there's probably an article about the 2020 presidential race and candidates, and it probably does not actually, it probably has a reference to an Iowa caucus without the date of when that is, much less the date of the November 2020 election. I don't know, is it November 4th, is it November 2nd, is it November 17th? We live in a country where the largest constituency are people who do not vote. And the media plays a role in that. And I think it's our job to provide people with the information they need to do that. And so I do think that the role of the media in treating prosecutors like the powerful elected offices in many places that they are will help, one, spread that information and that understanding, two, increase and as a result, increase public engagement in the electoral process for prosecutors. But three, make it so that prosecutors and communities are more aligned in what their expectations and outcomes are. If the vast majority of a community is unaware that their prosecutor is elected and they have a direct say, how can there be any expectation that prosecutor would be holding to their community values, much less their expectations? And so I think that is a big part of it. The other thing too, and one of the reasons it's important, this speaks to a question earlier, one of the questions earlier was what can communities and activists do now once you have a so-called progressive prosecutor elected? The prosecutors are going to hear from the other people. They're going to hear from the police.
Yep.
Right. When you think about the wave of prosecutors who've been elected across the country, not even just St. Louis County, where you have ADAs decide they're going to go join the police union, but St. Louis City, where the progressive prosecutor is dealing with subpoenas and public attacks from her police union, and not too far away in Chicago, where the police union is literally picketing the prosecutor in Cook County, in Boston, where before the prosecutor could even roll out, she announced that she was going to change the way they do drug charging, and before she could even detail the plans, was facing political opposition to an idea, and an idea that at that point had already proven itself effective in places like here in Philadelphia. A prosecutor in Orlando, where announces that she's not going to pursue the death penalty, has her prosecution powers stripped by the state legislature, and begins receiving nooses at her office. Right, the pressures are going to exist from the opponents of progressive prosecuting And so it's important that that equal community pressure and expectation exists on the other side. So I think that that's something that, and again, I think the media plays a role in that as well, right? That there's a lot to be said in terms of how we frame questions, how we frame coverage, what we're inquiring about and what we're not. And this is true across criminal justice. Coming off a year-long project or 18-month-long project on homicide impunity, when I talk about that project, very often I talk about the incentives that we create both as a society and as a media. But I personally know police chiefs who have gotten fired for homicide or violent crime going up. I know no police chiefs who've been fired for their failure to solve homicides, right? And frankly, one of those things is much more in control of the police chief than the other. So when we have to think about how we incentivize either smart prosecution or poor prosecution through the questions we ask, and how both as media members but also as a community writ large.
Yeah, the thoughts of being able to impact that federally are a bit scary, because obviously the system's been set up and designed very differently as the, whoever's in charge of the DOJ is putting out directives for judges, and us being able to impact that. That's just like a bank shot in terms of the electoral process. You have to be able to elect somebody higher up who's going to make, I think, like Trump has just appointed 38 federal judges or something. So that's a powerful institution, powerful office that has the capacity to impact quality of life, or the area of criminal justice reform, and therefore quality of life for millions of Americans. And I think that there is very little as community that we can do about that. It's that scary.
And it is, I mean, when you think about prosecutors, it's almost impossible. It's easy to sue a police officer. You can sue a police officer. Until municipalities understand that there are liabilities, even for prosecutors. Right now, you can't sue a prosecutor. You can sue a police, but you cannot. And so the only way that you can affect any change, and we continue to say it, is electorally. When we went through our last protest in St. Louis with Stockley, as long as we were downtown marching and raising hell, nothing happened. When we took a Sunday, through 90 days of protest, we took a Sunday, we said we're going to register voters. We got everybody's attention. And our problem is mainstream media doesn't educate or inform our folk. It just doesn't. If not for the St. Louis American and other black media, and now social media, because more of the activists are using social media in order to make sure that the narrative is not skewed. And so a Wesley Bell and other quote-unquote progressive prosecutors, any discussion in what they're doing gives us an opportunity to begin to educate people about the role of the prosecutor. And what we can do to change who the prosecutor is. But it's interesting, because I think that prior to Wesley and the last couple of years of electing progressive prosecutors, it's not been a discussion. We've talked about electing everybody but prosecutors, in our communities anyway. I don't recall any, maybe because I know that's what you do, but we haven't had that discussion. We talk about, we talk about the police and we talk about the judge, but very rarely do we talk about the middle person. And now that conversation is becoming more and more part of the activist new civil rights movement narrative.
This is a little bit more than just what Reverend was talking about here, but one thing that I saw throughout this election that I've not seen in any other election in St. Louis County or Missouri is the way in which people who would never otherwise be having conversations began having conversations. We had volunteers on our campaign from North County and from South County and from West County and from Mid County, and they all came together in ways that most of them maybe hadn't experienced before. There was a day probably 5 weeks prior to the primary. We had been in deep South County at a very wealthy nursing home, hosted by this lovely couple in their 80s who had 20 of their other white 80-year-old friends in their living room in this nursing home. And the reception that Wesley had in that room was one of the eye-opening experiences for me in the campaign, to watch people that looked like my grandparents look at him and say, we need you so badly in this county. We left there and we drove north and we stopped in mid-county. We were standing outside, it was a gorgeous day, in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. In the 15 minutes we stood in that parking lot, 4 individuals coming through the parking lot recognized him, stopped, got out of their car, came over, said hello, asked for a hug and a picture. He'd started to be recognized in public about a week prior to that. And before that, we had very low name recognition. That morning in South County, the afternoon in Mid-County, and then later that evening, we're in North County with young black men who can see in themselves, see Wesley and see a path forward for themselves. And the fact that that exists in St. Louis County gives me hope for our region coming together, not just in criminal justice reform, but so many of the issues that plague us. And this is one that if we can begin to put those pieces together collectively, we can begin to really shift things and move the ball forward.
Just like in a short way of talking about how to elect a progressive prosecutor, when we started thinking about how we were going to reduce the number of people in jails and prisons, we just merely reverse engineered the problem. And at some point, people ended up getting elected because they could be hyper punitive. So the reverse of that is to identify people who are going to be hyper restorative, and then to put all of the energy and effort to get those individuals elected. And if we want to look at what we need to do next in order to be able to maintain the offices that are required, in order for them to be able to change their internal culture, external culture, we actually do have to just take a look at what we've already done, how we got here, and then do the exact opposite. And that's unfortunately said that, nobody had been doing it. Well, that just means that there's we got here by 1,000 cuts, and it's going to take 1,000 Band-Aids, and this tactic and these strategies are just a little part of the healing that's going to actually build up to where we are just treating people a lot better in our response to crime in this country.
So sort of thinking about that, reverse engineering, I like that. So how can we reverse engineer sort of outside of Ferguson and other places? So specifically, there have been a couple questions that are sort of asking about other specific cities or counties where there are prosecutorial elections coming up, and people are wondering, what can we do right now to help with those places? So I sort of asked that question as, do you all have any specific counties that you're looking at right now that there's an election about to occur, and what suggestions do you have for those counties based on lessons from Ferguson? And this one question specifically is about New Orleans, which this questioner said seems to have many similarities to the case of Ferguson. There's a longtime incumbent who presides over an office with a deeply problematic civil rights history, and challenger who sits on the city council and comes from a defense background. So what can we say to these upcoming elections?
Yeah, so our original goal was to do 10, 10, and 10. 10 GOTV races all around prosecutorial reform. 10 GOTVs, voter education, 10 pieces of litigation, 10 pieces of legislation, 10 pieces of litigation. Ultimately, the success of the campaign and the appetite for it across the country increased exponentially, so we did like 30 in the first year. So there are lots of places that are still coming on my mind across the country. And if you are interested, what you do is identify groups of people who have been most impacted by prosecutors. There are organizations who are already serving them, like that's always the first place to go. Then secondly, align with the larger movement that's being held up, like because Color Change, ACLU, and other organizations are now just working collaboratively to just hone how we partner and collaborate with those places. So you can still go to the big box institutions, but you should ultimately be looking at the people who have been impacted there. I want to say that we have been looking at Count Zero in Louisiana for years. And so there was a lot of work that was already done. In fact, part of the strategies to weaken him politically were to look at what are the opportunities to drop litigation, and then what is the legislation. So we put ourselves in an adversarial position in order to be able to build armies, and now the icing on the cake will be, we already know what the outcomes are that we want. We already have stories around them. People are already aware of it. And so the very next step is to remove him from that position. And so everybody in New Orleans is already prepared to do that. And so I'm hoping that we'll get a similar outcome as well.
We're working with two organizations, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which is the convention that Dr. King founded, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Both of those national organizations have identified the 10. When I mentioned the 10 states with the highest rates of mass incarceration. So we've identified those 10. So Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts is our National Social Justice Chair. We're meeting in July to identify our partners and to identify targets. The Progressive National Baptist Convention has made it very clear that over the next 2 to 4 years, they're going to be more actively engaged in trying to get the same results as we got in St. Louis. Once again, St. Louis has kind of awakened a lot of the national organizations to begin to look at how we can be more involved. And so we mentioned Mississippi, Texas, Arizona, Arkansas, obviously Louisiana is one of those states. Missouri's already been dealt with for now. We're pretty happy. And you know, talking to Dr. Butts, we believe that success breeds success. But the biggest thing here is that, once again, education. We've said that our role is going to be education. It's going to be voter registration, voter education, and we're ready to do some engagement. So we've identified those 10 states. And that's our model. I'm looking at Wesley. He's our model.
I don't know if you, Josi, or Wesley have any thoughts on places that are drawing your attention now, or where we can focus our energies.
You know, I don't have not necessarily in terms of pathways, because I'm still kind of watching the races play out, but I'm really interested in, there's a race in Queens that's happening right now. I'm really interested in Fairfax County in Virginia, which is near to where I am, and just trying to, and what I'm also frankly very interested in is what happens now that the first round of folks who are elected in a post-Ferguson world are starting to come up for re-election, or beginning to have conversations about whether they're running again, and what that looks like. Beyond that, you know, I'm also very interested in, you know, what happens after a controversy. You know, I spent a lot of time in Baltimore and paying attention to Baltimore, where Marilyn Mosby is still the state's attorney, and still doing her job every day. And in conversations with her and in kind of watching that play out, it's really interesting to see, even after massive opposition plays out, what does a prosecutor do, and how do they continue doing that work? How does the media strategy change? How does the public strategy change? How does the charging strategy change? But to still be able to try to alter what's happening actually inside of an office, even in the face of kind of massive opposition.
Yeah, I think what I anticipate is not what's typically going to happen with prosecutors. I think there'll be less energy and activity for this as time progresses, because the movement is now looking to effectuate change where there's still opposition. And right now, like in the city of Philadelphia and other locations, that's in the judicial space. So now the question is how do we influence judicial elections in the city of Philadelphia? Because once you get a progressive prosecutor and once his office is in alignment, the opposition happens somewhere still in the system. So that's the bottleneck. But also because of the presidential election and because criminal justice reform is a top line item. So I just think that it's always going to be a thing now. My goal and my dream would be for, you know, there to be single issue voters on criminal justice sometimes. Just to combat all the other single issue voters in the country who often dominate an election outcome, but you know, doesn't necessarily take into account how that impacts other people. I know we talked a little bit about, you talked about how the representation, how the election of a progressive prosecutor will be received in communities that are not as impacted by those particular issues. You know, not everybody wins. That's one of the things that we really learned. Like, you know, we've been losing for a long time. And then when you finally do get the office and you do get the power, you get to see what you look like to the other individuals from the inside looking outward. And so the question is when we gain power, are we compassionate? Are we open? Are we still in dialogue with other people, hoping to bridge gaps? Or are we just solid on our position, saying, listen, under no circumstance is this particular policy ever going to be in place? And not, you know, it's gray, but the acquisition and the leveraging of power isn't.
Well, with that, oh, nope, Josie, go ahead, please.
The one thing that I'm watching really closely as it comes to other offices, currently elected offices, is the data that is now beginning to be tracked and analyzed, and what that is telling us about the reforms that have been put in place. We could talk specifically here about DA Krasner, and from his, I believe, first 20 months in office, George Mason University did a study looking at 47,000 cases that had reductions in bail or release on recognizance to see if you could see a correlation between the reduction in bail and any increase in recidivism. And what they found is that when you don't force people to pay bail when they don't have that to pay, they're not more likely to reoffend. And that had been one of the largest criticisms that we dealt with during the campaign, is they have to have skin in the game. You can't remove this part of it. Bail is not meant to be punitive. And now to begin to have data coming out of offices that are implementing these reforms that shows, okay, this is what we wanted to do, and look, it's having the right result, great, we keep doing that. But also to see times when maybe we think this reform is gonna accomplish this, and maybe it's not. And that's what we're keenly looking at, is where are we able to course correct along the way as more things become available to us, and to really put a higher standard in place for why we do everything that we do. And that's what I'm most excited about for prosecutors.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for this amazing panel. Please join me in thanking them.